Hi friends, continuing to the chapter How to Win Friends and Influence People. How to impress people. Everyone who have ever a guest of Theodore Roosevelt was astonished at the range and diversity of his knowledge. Whether his visitor was a cowboy or a rough rider, a New York politician or a diplomat, Roosevelt knew what to say and how it was done. The answer was simple. Whenever Roosevelt expected a visitor, he sat up late the night before, reading up on the subjects in which he knew his guest was partially interested. For Roosevelt knew, as all leaders know, that royal road to a person's heart is to talk about the things he or she treasures most. The genial Williams Lyon Fields, essayist and professor of literatures at Yale, learned this lesson early in life. When I was 8 years old and was spending a weekend visiting my auntie's Libby Lindsay at her home in Holstein, he wrote in his essay on human nature, a middle aged man called one evening, and after a police skirmish with my aunt, he devoted his attendance to me. At the time, I happened to be excited about boats, and the visitors discussed the subject in the way that seems to be particularly interesting. After he left, I spoke to him with enthusiasm. What a man! My aunt informed me he was a New York lawyer, that he cared nothing whatever about boat, the that he took not the slightest interest in the subject. But why then did he talk all the time about boats? Because he is a gentleman. He saw you were interested in boats, and he talked about the things he knew would interest and please you. He made himself agreeable. And Wilson Lyon Field added, I never forgot my aunt's remark. As I write this chapter, I have before me a letter from Edward L. Calif, who was active in a Boy Scouts work. One day I found I needed a favor, wrote Mr. Calif. A big scout jamboree was coming off in Europe, and I wanted the president of one of the largest corporations in America to pay the expenses of one of my boys for the trip. Fortunately, just before I went to see this man, I heard that he had drawn a check for $1 million, and that after it was cancelled, he had had it framed. So, the first thing I did when I entered his office was to ask to see the check, a check for $1 million. I told him I will never knew that anybody had ever written such a check, and that I wanted to tell my boys that I had actually seen a check for $1 million. He gladly showed it to me. I admired it and asked him to tell me all about how it happened to be drawn. You notice, don't you, that Mr. Calf didn't begin by talking about the Boy Scouts or the Jambros in Europe, or what is it was he wanted. He talked in the terms of what interested the other man. Here is the result. Presently, the man I was interviewing said, by the way, what it was you wanted to see me about." So I told him. To my vast surprise, my calf continued, "He is not only guaranteed immediately what I asked for, but much more. I had asked him to send only one boy to Europe, but he sent 5 boys and myself. Gave me a letter of a credit for $1,000 and told us to stay in Europe for 7 weeks. He also gave me a letters of introduction to his branch presidents, putting themselves at our service, and he himself met us in Paris and showed us the town. Since then, he has given jobs and some of the boys whose parents were in want, and he is still active in our groups. Yet, I know if I haven't found out what he was interested in and got him warmed up first, I wouldn't have found him 1/10 as easy to approach. Is this a valuable technique to use in business? Is it? Let's see. Take Henry G. of Duvorny and Sons, a wholesale baking firm in New York. Mr. Duvorny had been trying to sell breads to all certain New York hotels. He had cancelled on the manager every week for 4 years. He went to the same social affairs the manager attended. He even took rooms in the hotel and lived there in order to get the business, but he failed. Then, said Mr. Duvorny, after studying human relations, I resolved to change my tactics. I decided to find out what interested this man, what caught his enthusiasm. I discovered he belonged to a society of hotel executives called the Hotel Greeters of America. He not only belongs, but his bubbling enthusiasm has made him president of the organization, a president of an internal greeter. No matter where it conversions were held, he would be there. So when I saw him the next day, I began talking about the greeters. What a response I got! What a response! He talked to me for half an hour about the greeters, his tone vibrant with enthusiasm. I could plainly see that this society was not only his hobby, it was a passion of his life. Before I left to his office, he had sold me a membership in his organization. In the meantime, I had said nothing about the bread, but a few days later, the steward of his hotel phoned me to come over with a sample and the prices. I don't know what you did to the old boy, the steward greeted me, but he sure is sold on you. Think of it, I haven't been drumming at the man for 4 years, trying to get his business, and I would still be drumming at him if I haven't finally taken the trouble to find out what he was interested in and what he is enjoyed talking about. Edward E. Harriman of Hagerstown, Maryland, chose to live in the beautiful Cumberland Valley of Maryland after he completed his military services. Unfortunately, at the time, there were few jobs available in that area. A little research uncovered the fact that a number of companies in that area were either owned or controlled by an unusual business maverick, R.J. Funkhauser, who rise from the poverty to riches engrossed Mr. Harriman. However, he known for being inaccessible to job seekers. Mr. Harriman wrote, I interviewed a number of people and found that this major interest was anchored in his drive for the power and money. Since he protected himself from people like me by use of a dedicated and stern security, I studied her interest and the goals, and only then I paid an unannounced visit at her office. She has been Mr. Funkhauser orbiting satellite for about 15 years. When I told her I had a proposition for him, which might translate itself into financial and the political success for him, she became enthusiastic. I also conversed with her about her conservative participation in his success. After this conversation, she arranged for me to meet Mr. Funkhauser. I entered his huge and impressive office determined not to ask directly for a job. He was seated behind a large carved desk and thundered at me. How about it, young man? I asked. I said, Mr. Funkhauser, I believe I can make money for you. He immediately rose and invited me to sit in one of the large unpolarized chairs. I enumerated my ideas and the qualifications. I had to realize these ideas as well as how they would contribute to his personal success and that of his business. RJ, as he became known to me, hired me at once, and for me over 20 years I have been grown in his enterprises and we both have proposed. Talking in the terms of the other person's interest pays off for both parties. Howard Z. Herzing, a leader in the field of employee communications, has always followed this principle. When asked what rewards he got from it, Mr. Herzing responded that he not only received a different reward from each person, but that in the general the reward had been an enlarged of his life each time he spoke to someone. Talk in the terms of the other person's interest. How to make people like you instantly. I was waiting in the line to register a letter in the post office at 33rd Street and 8th Avenue in New York. I noticed the clerk appeared to be bored with the job, waiting envelopes, handing out the stamps, making changes, issuing the receipts, the same monotonous grids year after year. So I said to myself, I am going to try to make that clerk like me. Obviously, to make him like me, I must say something nice, not about myself, about him. So I asked myself, what is there about him that I can honestly admire? That is sometimes a hard question to answer, especially with strangers, but in this case, it happens to be easy. I instantly saw something I admired no end. So, while he was waiting my envelope, I remarked with enthusiasm, I certainly wish I had your head of hair. He looked up, half startled, his face beaming with a smile. Well, isn't as good as it is used to be, he said modestly. I assured him that although it might have lost some of its prestige glory, nevertheless it was still magnificent. He was immensely pleased. We carried out on a pleasant little conversation, and the last thing he said to me was, many people have admired my hair. I will bet that person went out to lunch that day walking on the air. I will bet he went home that night and told his wife about it. I will bet he looked in his mirror and said, it is a beautiful head of a hair. I told this story once in a public, and a man asked me after that, what did you want to get out of him? What was I trying to get out of him? What was I trying to get out of him? If we are so contemporarily selfish that we can't radiate a little happiness and pass on a bit of honest appreciation without trying to get something out of other person in return, If our souls are no bigger than sour crab apples, we shall meet with the failure we so richly deserves. Oh, yes, I did want something out of that chap. I wanted something priceless, and I got it. I got the feeling that I had done something for him without his being able to do anything, whatever in the returns for me. That is a feeling that flows and sinks in your memory long after the incident is past. Therefore, is no all important law of human conduct. If we obey the laws, we shall almost never get into trouble. In fact, the law is obeyed will bring us countless friends and constant happiness. But the very instant we break the laws, we shall get into endless troubles. The loss is this: always make the other person feel important. John Dewey, as we have already noted, said that the desire to be important is the deepest urge in human nature. And William James said that the deepest principle in human nature is the carving to be appreciated. As I have already pointed out, it is this urge that differentiates us from the animals. It is that this urge that has been responsible for civilization itself. Philosophers have been speculating on the rules of human relationship for thousands of years, and out of all that speculation, there have involved only one important precept. It is not new, it is as old as history. Zoroaster taught it to his followers in Persia 2500 years ago. Confucius preached it in China 24 century ago. Loyatas, the founder of Taoism, taught it to his disciple in the valley of Han. Buddha preached it in the bank of Holy Ganges 500 years before Christ. The sacred book of Hinduism taught it 1,000 years before that. Jesus taught it among the stony hills of Judah 19th century ago. Jesus summoned it up in one thought, probably the most important rule in the world. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. You want to approval of these with whom you come in contact. You want recognition of your true worth. You want a feeling that you are important in your little world. You don't want to listen to cheap, insincere flattery, but you do crave sincere appreciation. You want your friends and the associates to be, as Charles Schwab put in, heartily in their approbations and lavish in their price. All of us wants that. So let's obey the golden rule and give unto others what we would have others given unto us. How? When? Where? The answer is all the time, everywhere. David G. Smith of Clare, Wisconsin, told one of our classes how he handled a delicate situation when he was asked to take charge of the refreshment booth at a charity concert. The night of the concert, I arrived at the park and found two elderly ladies in a very bad humor standing next to the refreshment stand. Apparently, each thought that she was in the charge of the product. As I stood there pondering what to do, one of the members of the sponsoring committee appeared and handed me a cash box and thanked me for taking over the project. She introduced Rose and Jane as my helpers and then ran off. A great silence ensues. Realizing that the cash box was a symbol of authority. I gave the box to Rose and explained that I might not be able to keep the money straight and that if she took care of it, I would feel better. I then suggested to Jane that she show two teenagers who has been assigned to refreshments how to operate the soda machine, and I asked her to be responsible for the part of the project. The evening was very enjoyable with Rose happily counting the money, Jane supervising the teenagers, and me enjoying the concert. You don't have to wait until you are ambassador to France or chairman of a Comeback committee of your lodge before you use this philosophy of appreciation. You can work magic with it almost every day. If, for example, the waitress brings us mashed potatoes when we have ordered french fries, let's say, I am sorry to trouble you, but I prefer french fries. She will probably reply, no trouble at you, and will be glad to change the potatoes because we have shown respect of her. Little phrases says such as I am sorry to trouble you. Would you be so kind as to? Won't you please? Would you mind? Thank you. Little courtesies like these oil the gorges of the monotonous grind of everyday's life, and incidentally, they are the hallmarks of good breedings. Let's take another illustration. Hal Carney's novel, The Christian, The Demonsters, The Marksman. Among them were all bestsellers in the early parts of this century. Millions of the people read his novels, countless millions. He was the son of a blacksmith. He never had more than 8 years schooling in his life. Yet when he died, he was the richest literacy man of his time. The story goes like this. Hal Caine loved sonnet and ballads, so he devoured all of a Dante Gabriel Rossetti poetry. He even wrote a lecture chanting the praises of a Rossetti architectic achievements and sent a copy to Rossetti himself. Rossetti was delighted. Any young man who have such an exalted opinion of my ability, Rossetti probably said to himself, must be brilliant. So Rossetti invited this blacksmith son to come to London and act as his secretary. That was the turning point in Hal Carney's life, for in his new position he met the literacy artists of the day. Profiting by their advice and inspired by their encouragement, he launched upon a career that embellished his name across the sky. His home, Guebra Castle, on the Isle of Man, became a mecca for the tourists from the far corners of the world, and he left a multi-million dollars estate. Yet who knows, he might have died poor and unknown had he not written any essay expressing his admiration for a famous man. Such in the stupendous power of spine care, heartfelt appreciation. Rossetti considered himself important. That is not strange. Almost everyone considers himself important, very important. This life of many a person could probably be changed if only someone would make him feel important. Ronald J. Rowland, who is one of the infrastructures of our courses in California, is also a teacher of arts and crafts. He wrote to us about a student named Chris in his beginning craft classes. Chris was a very quiet, shy boy lacking in self-confidence, the kind of a student that often does not receive the attention he deserves. I also teach an advanced class that had grown to be somewhat of a status symbol and a privilege for a student to have earned the right to be in it. On Wednesday, Chris was delightingly working at his desk. I really felt there was a hidden fire deep inside him. I asked Chris if he would like to be in his advanced class. How I wish I could express the look in Chris' face. The emotion in that shy 14 years old boy trying to hold back his tears. Who, me? Mr. Rowell? Am I good enough? Yes, Chris, you are good enough. I have to leave at the point because tears were coming to my eyes. As Chris walked out of the class that day, seemingly 2 inches taller, he looked at me with bright blue eyes and said in a positive voice, "Thank you, Mrs. Rowlett." Chris taught me a lesson I will never forget. A deep desire to feel important. To help me never forgot this rule. I made a sign with reads, "You are important." This sign hung in the front of the classroom for all to see and to remind that each student I face is equally important. The unvarnished truth is that almost all people you met feel themselves superior to you in some ways, and your way to their hearts is to let them realize in some suitable way that you recognize their importance and recognize its sincerity. Remember what Emerson said, "Every man I met is my superior in some way, in that I learned on him." At the pathetic part of it, it is that frequently those who have least significant justification for a feeling of achievement blasters up their egos by a show of tumult and conceit, which is truly nauseating. As Shakespeare put it, proud man, dressed in a little brief authority, plays such fantastic tricks before high heaven. Ask, make the angle weep. I am going to tell you how business people in my own courses have applied these principles with remarkable results. Let's take the case of a Connecticut attorney. Because of his relative, he prefers not to save his name mentioned. Shortly after joining the course, Mr. R drove to Long Island with his wife to visit some of her relatives. She felt him to chat with an old aunt of her and then rushed off by herself to visit some of the younger relatives. Since he soon have to give a speech professionally on how he applied the principles of appreciation, he thought that he would gain some worthwhile experience talking with the elderly ladies. So he looked around the house to see what he would honestly admire. "This house was built about 1890, wasn't it?" he inquired. "Yes," she replied. "That is preciously the year it was built. It reminds me of the house I was born in," he said. "It's beautiful, well built, roomy. You know, they don't build houses like this anymore." "You're right," the old lady agreed. "The young folks nowadays don't care for beautiful homes. All they want is a small apartment and they go off gaddling about in their automobiles. This is a dream house," she said in a voice vibrating with tender memories. "This house was built with love. My husband and I dreamed about it for years before we built it. We didn't have an architect. We planned it all ourselves." She showed Mr. R about the house and he expressed his heartily admired for beautiful treasures she had picked up in her travel and cherished over a lifetime. Paisley, Schloss, and Old English tea sets, wheat growth china, French beds, and the chair, Italian painting, and silk draperies that had once hung in the French Chutta. After showing Mr. R through the houses, she took him out to the garage. There, jacked up on the blocks, was a Packard car in mint condition. My husband bought that car for me shortly before he passed on. She said softly, I have never ridden it since his death. You appreciate nice things, and I am going to give this car to you. Why, Auntie? He said. You overwhelm me. I appreciate your generosity, of course, but I couldn't possibly accept it. I am not even a relative of yours. I have a new car, and you have many relatives that would like to have that backwards. Relatives? She explained. Yes, I have relatives who are just waiting till I die so that they can get that car, but they are not going to get it. If you don't want to give it to them, you can very easily sell it to the second hand dealers, he told her. Sell it, she cried. Do you think I would sell this car? Do you think I could stand to see strangers riding up and down the streets in this car? That car that my husband bought for me. I wouldn't dream of selling it. I'm going to give it to you. You appreciate beautiful things. He tried to get out of accepting the car, but he couldn't without hurting her feelings. This lady, left all alone in a big house with her preciously shawl, her French antics, and her memories, was starving for a little recognition. She had once been young and beautiful and sought after. She had once built a house warm with love and had collected things from all over the Europe to make it beautiful. Now, in the isolated loneliness of the old age, she craved a little human warmth, a little genuine appreciation, and no one gave it to her. When she found it, like a spring in the desert, her gratitude couldn't adequately express itself with anything less than that the gift of her cherished Packard. Let's make another case. Donald M. McMahon, who was a superintendent of Lewis and Valentine, nurserymen and landscape architects in Rye, New York, related this incident. Shortly after I attended the talk on how to win friends and influence people, I was landscaping the estates of a famous attorney. The owner came out to give me a few instructions about where he visited to plant a mass of azaleas. I said, Judge, you have a lovely hobby. I have been admiring your beautiful dog. I understand you win a lot of blue ribbons every year at the show in the Madison Square Garden. The effect of this little expressions of appreciation was striking. Yes, the judge replied. I don't have a lot of fun with my dogs. Would you like to see my kennel? He spent almost an hour showing me his dog and the prices they have on. He even brought out their pedigrees and explained about the bloodlines responsible for such beauty and intelligence. Finally, turning to me, he asked, Do you have any small children? Yes, I do, I replied. I have a son. Well, wouldn't he like a puppy? The judge inquired. Oh, yes, he would be tickled pink. All right, I am going to give him one, the judge announced. He started to tell me how to feed the puppy. Then he paused. You will forget it. I will tell you. I will write it out. So the judge went into the house, typed out the pedigree and feeding instructions, and gave me a puppy worth several $100s and 1 hour 15 minutes of his valuable time, largely because I have expressed my honest administration for his hobby and achievements. George Eastman of Kodak fame invented the transparent film that made motion pictures possible, amassed a fortune of $100 million and made himself one of the most famous businessmen on earth. Yet, in spite of all these tremendous accomplishments, he craved little recognition even as you and I. To illustrate, when Eastman was building the Eastman School of Music and also Kilbourne Hall in Rochester, James Adamson, then president of the Superior Seating Company of New York, wanted to get the order to supply the theatre chairs for these buildings. Phoning the architect, Mr. Adamson made an appointment to see Mr. Eastman in Rochester. When Adamson arrived, the architect said, "I know you want to get this order, but I can tell you right now that you won't stand a ghost of a show if you take more than 5 minutes of George Eastman time. He is a strict discrimination. He is very busy, so tell you your shot quickly and get out." Adamson was prepared to do just that. When he was urged into the room, he saw Mr. Eastman bending over a pile of paper on his desk. Presented, Mr. Eastman looked up, removed his glasses, and walked toward the architect and Mr. Adamson, saying, "Good morning, gentlemen. What can I do for you?" The architect introduced them, and then Mr. Adamson said, "While we have been waiting for you, Mr. Eastman, I have been admiring your office. I wouldn't mind working in a room like this myself. I am in the interior woodworking business and I never saw a more beautiful office in all my life." George Eastman replied, "You remembered me of something I have almost forgotten. It is beautiful, isn't it? I enjoyed it a great deal when it was first built. But I came down here now with a lot of over things on my mind and something don't even see the room for a weeks at a time." Adamson walked over and rubbed his hand across the panel. "This is English oak, isn't it? A little different textures from Italian oak." "Yes," Eastman replied, "imported English oak. It was selected for me by a friend who specialized in fine woods." Then Eastman showed him about his room, commenting on the proportions, the colorings, the hand carvings, and other effects he had helped to plan and execute. While drifting about the room, admiring the wood's work, they paused before a window, and George Eastman, in his modesty, soft-spoken way, pointed out some of the institutions through which he was trying to help humanity: the University of Rochester, the General Hospital, the Homeopathic Hospital, and the Friendly Home, the Children's Hospital. Mr. Anderson congratulated him warmly on the idealistic way he was using his wealth to alleviate the sufferings of humanity. Presently, George Eastman unlocked a glass case and pulled out the first camera he had ever owned, an invention he had bought from an Englishman. Adamson questioned him at length about his yearly struggles to get started in business, and Mr. Eastman spoke with real feeling about the poverty of his childhood, telling how his widowed mother had kept a boarding house while he clerked him in an insurance office. The terror of poverty haunted him day and night, and he resolved to make enough money so that his mother wouldn't have to work. Mr. Adamson drew him out with his future questions and listened, absorbed, while he related the story of his experiments with dry photographic plates. He told how he had worked in an office all the day and sometimes experimental all nights, taking only brief naps while the chemicals were working, sometimes working and sleeping in the same cloth for 72 hours at a stretch. James Adamson has been urged into Eastman's office at 10:15 and have been warned that he must not take more than 5 minutes. But an hour had passed. Then 2 hours passed and they were still talking. Finally, George Eastman turned to Adamson and said, "The last time I was in Japan, I bought some chair, brought them home, and put them in my sun porch, but the sun pleaded the paint. So I went down the other day and bought some paint and painted the chair myself. Would you like to see what sort of job I can do to paint chairs? All right, come up to my home and have lunch with me. I will show you." After lunch, Mr. Eastman shows Adamson the chair he has brought from Japan. They weren't worth more than a few dollars, but George Eastman, now a multimillionaire, was proud of them because he himself has painted them. The order for the seat amount to be $90,000. Who do you suppose to get the orders? James Adamson or one of his competitors? For the time of the story, until Eastman's death, he and James Adamson were close friends. Claude Marius, a restaurant owner in Rouen, France, used this principle and saved his restaurant the loss of a key employee. This woman has been in his employ for 5 years and was a vital link between Mr. Marias and his staff of 21 people. He was shocked to receive a registered letter from her advising him for her resignation. Mr. Marias reported, "I was very surprised and I even more disappointed because I was under the impression that I have been fair to her and respectful to her needs, in as much as she was a friend as well as an employee. I probably had taken her too much for granted, and I maybe was even more demanding for her than of other employees. I could not, of course, accept this resignation without some explanation. I took her aside and said, 'Plato, you must understand that I cannot accept your resignation. You mean a great deal to me and this company, and you are as important to the success of this restaurant as I am.' I repeated this in front of entire staff, and I invited her to my home and returned my confidence in her with my family present. Plato withdrew her resignation, and today I can rely on her as never before. I frequently reinforce this by expressing my appreciation for what she does and showing her how important she is to me and to the restaurant. They talk to the people about themselves," said Desailly, one of the shrewdest men who ever ruled the British Empire. "Talk to the people about themselves and they will listen for hours. Make the other person feel important and do it sincerely. You can't win an argument." Shortly after the close of World War I, I learned an invaluable lesson one night in London. I was a manager at the time for Sir Ross Smith. During the war, Sir Ross has been the Australian aide out in Palestine and shortly after a peace was declared, he astonished the world by flying halfway around it in 30 days. No such feat had ever been attempted before. I created a tremendous sensation. The Australian government awarded him $50,000. The King of England knighted him, and for a while he was the most talked about man under the Union Jack. I was attended a banquet one night, even giving in Sir Rose a honor, and during the dinner, the man sitting next to me told a humorous story which hinged on the quotation. There is a divinity that shapes our end, rough, new, them how we will. The Ranconus mentioned that the quotation was from the Bible. He was wrong. I knew that. I knew it is positively. There couldn't be the slightest doubt about it. And so to a feeling of importance and displaying my superiority, I appointed myself as an unsocialistic and unwelcome committee of one to correct him. He stuck to his guns. What? From Shakespeare. Impossible, absurd. That quotation was from the Bible, and he knew it. The storyteller was sitting on my right, and Frank Gamble, on an old friend of mine, was seated at my left. Mr. Gammon has devoted years to study of the Shakespeare. So the storyteller and I agreed to submit the question to Mr. Gammon. Mr. Gammon listened, kicked up me under the table, and then said, Dal, you are wrong. The gentleman is right. It is from the Bible. On your way home that night, I said to Mr. Gammon, Frank, you knew that quotation was from Shakespeare. Yes, of course, he replied. Hamlet, Act 5, Sense 2. But we were guests at a festival occasions, my dear Dale. Why to prove a man he is wrong? Is that going to make him like you? Why not let him save his face? He didn't ask you for opinion. He didn't want it. Why argue with him? Always avoid the acute angle. The man who said that taught me a lesson I will never forget. I not only had made the storyteller uncomfortable, but I had put my friend in an embarrassing situation. How much better it would have been had I not become an argumentative. I was so sorely needed lesson because I have been a investigator arguer. During my youth, I have argued with my brother about everything under the Milky Way. When I went to the college, I studied logic and the argumentation and went into for debating contest. Talk about the being from Missouri, I was born there. I had to be shown. Later, I thought debating and argumenting in New York, and once I was ashamed to admit. I plan to write a book on the subject. Since then, I have listened to, engaged in, and watched the effects of thousands of the arguments. As a result of all this, I have come to the conclusion that there is only one way under high heaven to get the best of an argument, and this is to avoid it. Avoid is as you would avoid rattle, snakes, and earthquakes. 9 times out of 10, an argument ends with each the Constance more firmly convinced than ever that he is absolutely right. You can't win an argument, you can't, because if you lose it, you lose it, and if you win it, you lose it. Why? Well, suppose you trim over the other man and shoot his argument full of holes and prove that he is non compos mentis. Then what? You will feel fine. But what about him? You made him feel inferior. You have hurt his pride. He will resent your trims, and a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. Years ago, Patrick J. Harine joined one of my classes. He had little education, and how he loved a scarf. He had once been a scoffer, and he came to me because he has been trying, without much success, to sell the trucks. A little questioning brought out the fact that he was continuously scrapping with an analogical the very people he was trying to do business with. If a prospects said anything derogatory about the trucks he was selling, Pat saw red and was right at the customer's throat. Pat won a lot of arguments in those days, and he said to me afterwards, I often walked out of an office saying, I told that the birds sometime. Sure, I have told him something, but I hadn't sold him anything. My first problem was not to teach Patrick's Harry to talk. My immediate task was to train him to refrain from talking and to avoid verbal fights. Mr. Harry became one of the star salesmen for the White Motor Company in New York. How did he do it? Here is his story in his own words. If I walk into a buyer offices now and he says, what, a white truck? There is no goods. I wouldn't take one if you gave it to me. I am going to buy the Who's It truck. I say, the Who's It is a good truck. If you buy the Who's It, you will never make a mistake. The Who's It are made by a fine company and sold by good people. He is speechless then. There is no room for an argument. If he says that the Who's It is the best, and I say, sure it is. It is the best when I agreed with him. We then get off the subjects of Who's It, and I begin to talk about the good points of white trucks. There was a time when a remark like his first one would have made me see scarlet and red and orange. I would start arguing against the Who's It, and the more I argued against it, the more my prospect argued in favor of it, and the more he argued, the more he sold himself on my competitor's project. As I look back now, I wonder how I was ever able to sell anything. I lost a year of my life in scrapping and arguing. I keep my mouth shut now. It's pay, as wise old Ben Franklin used to say. If you argue and rankle and contradict, you may achieve a victory sometimes, but it will be an empty victory because you will never get your opponent's goodwill. So figure it out for yourself. Which would you rather have, an academic, theoretical victory or a person's goodwill? You can seldom have both. The Boston transcripts one printed this bit of significant. Here lies the body of William J., who died maintaining his right of way. He was right, dead right, as he sped along. But he is just as dead as if he were wrong. You may be right, dead right, as you speed along in your argument, but as far as changing another's mind is concerned, you will probably be just as futile as you are strong. Frederick S. Parson, an income tax consultant, had been disputing and wrangling for an hour with the government tax inspector. An item of $9,000 was at stock. Mr. Parson claimed that this $9,000 was in reality a bad debt, that it would never be collected, that it ought not to be taxed. Bad debit, my eye, reported the inspector. I must be taxed. This inspector was cold, arrogant, and stubborn. Mr. Panson said as he told the story to the classes, reasons was wasted and so were facts. The longer were argued and the more stubborn he became. So I decided to avoid arguments, change the subject and give him an appreciation. I said, I suppose this is a very petty matters in comparison with the really important and difficult decisions you have required to make. I have made a study of a taxation myself, but I have had to get my knowledge from books. You are getting your from firing lines of experience. I sometimes wish I had a job like yours. It would teach me a lot. I mean every word I say. Well, the inspector, I mean every word I said. The inspector straightened up his chair, leaned back, and talked for a long time about his work, telling me of the clever frauds he has uncovered. His tone gradually became friendly, and presently he was telling me about his children. As he left, he advised me that he would consider my problem further and give me his decisions in few days. He called at my office 3 days later and informed me that he had decided to leave the tax receipt exactly as it was filled. The tax inspector was demonstrating one of the most common of human frailties. He wanted a feeling of importance. As long as Mr. Parsons argued with him, he got his feelings of importance by loudly asserting his authority. But as soon as his importance was admitted and the argument stopped, and he was pretended to expand this ego, he became a sympathetic and kindly human being. Buddha said that hatred is never entered by hatred but by love, and a misunderstanding is never ended by argument, by an tact, diplomacy, conciliation, and a sympathetic desire to see the other person's viewpoint. Lincoln once reprimanded a young army officer for including into a violent controversy with an associate. No man who is resolved to make the most of himself, said Lincoln, can spare time for personal conditions. Still less can be afforded to take the consequences, including the violation of his temper and the loss of self-control. Largest things to which you show no more than equal rights, and lesser ones though clearly you won't. Better you give your path to a dog than be bitten by him in contesting for the right. Even killing the dog would not cure the bite. In an article in Bits and Pieces, some suggestions are made on how to keep a disagreement from becoming an agreement. Welcome the disagreement. Distract your first intensive impression. Control your temper. Listen first. Look for areas of agreement. Be honest. Promise to think over the opponent's ideas and study them carefully. Thanks your opponent sincerely for their interest. Postpone action to give both sides time to think through the problem. The only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. 6 ways to make people like you. First, become genuinely interested in other people. Second, the smile. Third, remember that a person's name is to that person's the sweetest and the most important sound in any language. Fourth, Be a good listener. Encourage others to talk about themselves. Fifth, talk in the terms of the other person's interest. Sixth, make the other person feel important and do it sincerely.